Welcome to this edition of the Capitol Notebook. I'm Mike Friesen. With us for our program today, Assemblyman Brian Kolb. Assemblyman Kolb is the minority leader of the New York State Assembly. He also represents an assembly district in the Finger Lakes in central New York. We want to thank you folks all across New York State for joining us. Assemblyman Kolb, another difficult week here at the state capitol. Difficult in the sense that one of your colleagues resigned from the House in disgrace. This is a fellow that I think we've talked about in other programs in this series, and that's Assemblyman Vito Lopez of New York City, who had been accused by some women of sexual harassment, a protracted discussion here at the state capitol, and he finally decided to step down. A lot of spotlight, though, put on the various issues of corruption and all at the state capitol. I think that's going to have to be what we talk about this week.
Well, I think it's an issue that in various parts of the state, Mike, it isn't showing up on people's radar screens. I mean, we've talked about this before, that sometimes people are worried about paying the bills, getting to work, going to school, taking care of their families, and it's almost this whole wave of it's just, the same old, whether it's Albany or Washington. And certainly I think that, but for those that do pay attention and do care about it, I think it's a subject that we should talk about, because there's been a lot of words but not enough action in terms of putting real meat into ethics reform. Attempts have been made, but I think not severe enough attempts to really say that we're not going to self-protect ourselves as elected officials in Albany. And that's really the key about the Public Officers Accountability Act and other reform measures that I and other members of the legislature are pushing for, and pushing the governor on, pushing the two majorities, the Senate majority, and the Senate majority coalition, the Assembly majority, Eric Schneiderman, Attorney General, Tom DiNapoli, State Comptroller, and all the legislative members. We have rolled out ideas that I think should become part of a discussion, part of a dialogue, on really tightening the framework in terms of which legislators operate in Albany from an ethical perspective.
Well, it's the Public Officer Accountability Act that you just referenced is a compilation of ideas that you and your conference have put together geared to do something about it. But let's stay with that last thing that you mentioned there, the public officers in this state acting ethically. I mean, I understand the idea that every group of people is going to have some people within that organization or that community that don't act according to code. But oh my, the amount of it happening at the state legislature, or at least all that seems to be coming to the fore right now, it seems to be rather overwhelming.
Well, it's overwhelming, but also very unfortunate. And the bulk of the folks that have been caught in the corruption scandals are predominantly from New York City. That doesn't mean all from New York City, but predominantly. We've talked about that on your show before. And really, we can have the toughest ethics laws in the nation. It won't prevent someone from breaking the law. But what we're really attempting to do is send a very strong message. If you do break the law, there are consequences. If you should lose your pension, if you've been convicted of a crime, you should not be able to use campaign finance account to fund your legal defense while you're fighting criminal charges, and charges that as you're acting as a public officer for New York State. So it's about sending a message to everybody that, look, if this bad behavior exists, there's going to be severe consequences. You're not going to be protected. Severe penalties. You're not going to be protected. And also it sends a message to the public at large that we're serious about policing ourselves, setting a higher standard, which is the goal. It's never going to eliminate it all, but I think it will help minimize potential bad behavior.
Severe penalties seems to be something that the people watching this program who are following this could understand, because in so many instances it seems as if we see the elected officials, when they go through the process and end up convicted and sentenced, oftentimes not so much bad happens to them.
Well, that's not necessarily true. It's just that not enough bad things happen to them that have had bad behavior. In other words, that there could be some criminal prosecution, there could be some fines involved, there could be the fact that they serve some jail time. But one of the things that, from a financial perspective, is the taxpayer should not be on the hook for their pensions which is sort of a financial reward is from the taxpayer. And I think that's key. I think also that we've had legislators that have left office and run again for office under the dark cloud, and Vito Lopez is one of them. Roger Green was another, where Roger Green left office and then turned around the following year and got reelected. Last November, Vito Lopez got reelected, even though it was very well known that he was under the microscope for the sexual harassment with the young women that work for him. So this is what you're also dealing with, is that a general public in some of these districts that are not, shall we say, holding their elected official accountable. I can say this for sure, that if I was convicted of something, my district would have me out in a heartbeat. They'd never vote for me again. And that's not the case in all the districts. So we have to try to take some dramatic steps that hopefully will make people pause before they think about breaking the law.
And that mindset is epitomized by another thing that's going on right now. We are about, I was just doing the math in my head, about 6 months away from this November when there will be a mayoral election in New York City. And one of the fellows who's just announced he's going to run for that position is former Congressman Anthony Weiner, who, found himself in all sorts of trouble. Nobody would ever think he'd be electable again, but he's putting himself out there and thinking maybe, I don't know what he's thinking. Maybe that nobody will notice or what he's thinking, but he seems to think that based on maybe some of the examples you've just cited, maybe he's got a shot.
Well, that's the same case with Vito Lopez, who says he's going to run for a city council seat. Now, I don't know whether he will stick to that plan or not, but this is exactly my point. And one of the things we've said is that once you've been convicted of crime or whatever, you cannot run for public office again. So, or return to run for the same office. So there's a lot of little nuances that aren't little, but significant nuances that we're trying to push forward and have a public discussion about it. We've also said I think we should have a constitutional change where the voters of this state can have a recall election. In other words, if I don't like the job Mike Friesen as a state legislator is doing, or as a state comptroller or state attorney general, you put enough petition signatures together to call for a new vote to whether you stay in office or not. That's not a new premise. It's done in 19 states. 36 different state legislators have gone through a recall election throughout the country. A small percentage got reelected or got removed, I should say. In a gubernatorial side, Gray Davis in California was removed. Mm-hmm. Scott Walker in Wisconsin was not removed, but they had an election which was re-verified by the voters that they still trust that elected official. I think recall elections is a huge premise that we should install, and that's separate from the Public Officers Accountability Act, because that's also a constitutional amendment legislation which you have to vote on in 2 consecutive legislatures to get that on the ballot.
In the case of Assemblyman Vito Lopez, let's talk a little bit about the process that took place, because there's been a lot of questions about that. The involvement of the Assembly's Ethics Committee. There's also this thing called JCOPE. That was set up by Governor Cuomo, I believe, after he took office. Are you satisfied with the oversight that there is in New York State for when these sorts of things come up?
No, I'm not. And that's one of the things with the Public Officers Accountability Act. I'm proposing, and we are proposing, that we consolidate JCOPE and Legislative Ethics Commission to an independent body that is filled by judges that are not, if you will, per se, legislative appointments, to have more independence and have more of a separate, what I call fair body, but also hopefully decisive body, because after JCOPE did its report, there was no meat to go along with the potatoes. There was no actions taken by JCOPE or recommendations from JCOPE. They really just bounced the ball back to the legislature. And that's what we were preparing to do, is a legislative resolution to have this matter forwarded to the Assembly Standing Committee on Ethics. So again, I think that's one other idea that I think that JCOPE is, quite frankly, has little teeth in its independence. There's been leaks out of the committee where information is filtered out that shouldn't have been filtered out, reports given out that shouldn't have been given out. And again, I'm not trying to question the character of the individual people there, but as a collective body, I don't think it's working.
Yeah, it was an interesting thing to watch after the district attorney from the metropolitan area announced that there was the charges, the accusations against Mr. Lopez didn't arrive to a level of criminality. That was when these reports then were free to be released. People saw what was in them, and they responded. Even the speaker said he was horrified about what he read in that report, that Mr. Lopez apparently the actions that he had taken. Those reports, while not rising, I guess, to enough to say that Mr. Lopez could be criminally pursued on this, still led to his downfall here at the state capitol, because it was very shortly after those reports came out that he was out the door.
Well, and the other thing too is I don't think Jay Kolb went far enough in analyzing, why wasn't this reported to this event? Why was a payment made on Mr. Lopez's behalf? Why wasn't it not reported to the Ethics Committee? If the assembly rules itself were broken, should there be repercussions? That's the whole point of setting up an independent body, that they can look at it and say, really, this is what they did wrong, this is what they should have done differently, and this is what they should do about fixing what they didn't do properly. And they didn't do that. They just sort of, this is what we heard, this is what we saw, but not enough, I think, with conclusions of what went wrong and what should have been done, and then remedial action to those that were involved in the entire process. Because don't forget that the State Comptroller's Office issued the check. Don't forget the Attorney General's Office of the State of New York had to sort of do a cursory review, albeit they say that they weren't part of the process, but they still were involved somehow. And then you have the role of the Assembly majority in this. So there's still, I think, unanswered questions, unanswered solutions, and that's why I felt, or do feel, we feel so strongly that Jay Kolb as a body is time for change.
A lot of questions, of course, still, as you just noted, about the Speaker's role in this. So do you think an investigation continues into the processes that are in place right now, as well as what might have gone wrong in terms of how it was handled by the Speaker's office, the Attorney General, the Comptroller's office, and so forth?
Well, yes, and we just focusing on sexual harassment, there's a new task force being created between members, and just in the State Assembly, of Democrats and Republicans to kind of say, okay, what should we do? Should we have an independent body? How's that? Just dealing with sexual harassment. And the Speaker said he made a mistake. We've changed the internal Assembly rules that any complaint doesn't have to be in writing. It can be verbally or in writing, and that anything is going to be referred going forward from now on. Now, it was supposed to be referred before, and it was ignored. So that's the question, is, well, what really is going to prevent this from even somebody else that's serving as Speaker from ignoring the rules that have been established? So that's what we have folks in the legal community looking at, and see whatever else needs to be done.
Down to our last minute here, but that idea that the Speaker that's involved here has been Speaker for a very long time, a lot longer than many other members in the House, so there's some concern that maybe a Speaker who has been in place that long has a lot of influence over the members and the staff and so forth. You've called for term limits for legislative leaders. Is that still part of your plan?
That's correct. I've introduced legislation so that there's term limits not only for leaders as a starting point, but also committee chairs, term limits for those in the Senate and the Assembly, so that there's a turnover, that no one gets entrenched for so long in time that power or absolute power corrupts, and that's part of it. And again, we can even have a dialogue about whether there should be term limits for legislators. I think it should all be on the table, public hearings, and let's see where it takes us to. If
you folks watching want to give any feedback to Assembly Minority Leader Brian Kolb, you can do that by contacting him at his office in Albany. That's room 933 of the LOB. You can do that by picking up the phone and dialing in the 518 area code 455-3751, or probably the easiest thing to do, send an email, kolb@assembly.state.ny.us. Brian Kolb, thanks for joining us today. I'm sure we'll be talking more about this as this legislative session prepares to wind down over the next few weeks. Thanks for joining us today.
Look forward to it.
Thank you, folks, for joining us. Hope to see you soon for our next edition of the Capitol Notebook.